Welcome back, guys. Thank you for entering the chamber once again. We're back from a long hiatus, and we're going to be hitting the video grind even harder than before. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Starter Frieza. This is a deck that came out as a structure deck back in set 10 as part of the Clan Collusion structure deck, and people at the time thought it had a lot of potential, but it's done basically nothing since it came out. And it's been overshadowed by a lot of other green leaders between OG Broly, Turles, things of that nature, even Clash Coup. Despite that, I think this is a greatly underestimated archetype, and today we're going to be showing you some cool interactions and stuff you can do with this deck to really give it some new life. So if you've been looking for a green deck that you can mess around with, that you have a lot of fun with, and it rips your opponent's hand apart and controls their board, this is something you should check out. Once again, let's get started with the leader. So, the leader has a permanent that says that you cannot include Saiyan cards. Not you can't play them, you can't include them. This is a really tight and punishing limitation. Sometimes, in particular, it means we can't use the Great Saiyaman Draw 2 bottom 1 super combos, which we would love to use in this deck. But there's enough non-Saiyans in the game that you can still build a really good deck despite that limitation. On top of that, he has an auto that when he swings, you can kill a Frieza's army. If you're attacking the leader card, you can kill one Frieza's army card in play, and then to make your opponent discard a card and optionally take a life. Importantly, the leader doesn't draw on his front side, and you only get that effect if you attack a leader. It is nice that he comes with an optional Self-Awaken, which you occasionally need to use, but for the most part, his front side is pretty lame, to be perfectly honest. It's not why we play this deck. You awaken at 4 lives or less, and you draw a card and untap an energy, and you turn into Last Resort Frieza. Now this is what makes this deck tick right here, is this awakened leader. So first, once awakened, he draws a card when he swings. His hand rip effect still requires you to kill a Frieza's army, but it's an activate main instead of an on attack auto, so you have some more flexibility with how you use it. In addition, you get to pick the card out of your opponent's hand at random, which is a vast improvement over letting your opponent discard a card. And it gives one of your unisons in play critical, which gives us a lot of on-board threat to attack our opponent without giving them resources. One of the main difficulties with playing this deck is managing how relatively lackluster your leader is on your front side, and the difficulty you can have at drawing cards compared to the intense power you have once you're awakened. Generally speaking, you'll want to awaken turn 3 if you can get there, but we'll talk about that later on. Now, we're going to talk about cards in a slightly different order than we usually do, because this deck is heavily synergy based. So to begin with, we have 4 copies of Frieza's Army Healing Pod. Pod has an auto, it's a field extra card with an auto that says anytime a green battle card from your drop area comes back into play, you draw a card. Once per turn, that is. It also has a activate main where you can pay 4 energy and play a battle card from your drop area, but we never use that. We only use this for the ability to draw a card whenever we play a card out of our drop. In this deck, if things are going right, you will basically be playing a card from your drop area every single turn, both on your turn and most of your opponent's turns as well, and we'll get to how you do that later on. One pod can easily draw you 6, 7, 8 cards over the course of a game. It's just going to say I'm at a card advantage, and this is what helps us make up for the fact that our leader doesn't draw on our front side. Now, the main way we constantly trigger our Frieza's Army Healing Pod is right here, with Dodoria, Frieza's Devoted Servant. This is a starter deck rare exclusive, and he's basically a one-man engine, where when he gets discarded for any skill while you have a unison play, he comes into play. Your leader on either side can then kill him to trigger the effect, make your opponent discard a card. And then Dodoria has an activate main, where for a single green energy, if you control a unison, you can put that Dodoria back into your hand. So the name of the game here, in total, is to find a way to discard Dodoria, pitch him, have him come into play, draw a card off of Frieza's Army Healing Pod, kill the Dodoria with our leader, and then buy the Dodoria back and repeat. We're going to be referencing this core chain and abusing Dodoria for the rest of the video, so it's important to remember and understand how Dodoria works if you're not familiar with the deck. Now, we did mention that you need to have a unison in play to trigger Dodoria, so we run 2 different unisons, and the first is 4 copies of Demigra, Unison of Sorcery. Demigra is a green staple for its ability to simply stick on the board and not be removed, since you can take life to keep it its marker count the same when it would lose a marker. Which is really useful for us because often we just need to have a unison in play. The way we get there we don't really care, as long as we can just get one there. Some lists will opt to use Bio Broly Unison because the Bio Broly Unison has a built-in discard 1, draw 1, which will trigger Dodoria on his own. When you find all of your pieces, Bio Broly is the better unison than Demigra, like hands down, when everything is, if you have like the perfect opening hand. But in all the rest of the time, when you kind of need to work your way there and survive and have a unison that actually does something, Demigra is far more useful for his ability to go up to a 15k and threaten things, on top of his ability to, clear our opponent's threats with his -3. Ideally, Demigra is our primary first turn play, and barring that, we can settle for playing a pod on turn 1. The other unison that we play, and it's also the big boss monster, if you will, for the deck, is 3 copies of Dark Broly, Overwhelming Evil. Dark Broly is a 20k double strike that, in conjunction with our leader, means he can become a 20 double strike critical threat. He has a +2 to discard a card, and then make our opponent discard a card and KO one of the battle cards. This will then trigger Dodoria and play Dodoria. So, between Demigra and our leader, we can make them discard a card of their choice, rip a card out of their hand of our choice at random with our leader, and then hit them with the 20 double strike critical, which will either take cards out of their hand or take cards out of their life. Either way, it's effectively still a couple of discards. Very, very, very powerful unison. We rarely use his +0 to attack our opponent's unisons, since we get so much value out of the +2. And what's great about Dark Broly is that between the fact that he's a 20k unison and he has a +2, he's basically impossible to remove. Barring Kai, he's just too big and gains too many markers. Once you play him, he sticks. And this is also why we tend to awaken on turn 3, because we'll usually tap out for this guy on turn 3 and then awaken to get an energy back to use for defense and other tricks. Now, into all of the synergy and support pieces. First, we have playset of Frieza, Charismatic Villain. This is a green staple in general, but it pulls double duty in this deck because it's also a Frieza's Army card, which means that after it comes down and has done its thing, optionally we can kill it after it's KO one of our opponent's cards to trigger our leader ability and also rip a card out of their hand. So we can kind of get like a little extra mileage out of this. So this saves us the use of Dodoria. In particular, early on in this deck, it can be hard to actually get a Frieza's Army card in play, so we don't always attack a lot with our leader early on. Villain gives us a way to do that. Just a great all-around card in general, and it's extra useful here. Next, the other common green staple that we run is 4 copies of Dormant Potential Unleashed. Everybody knows this card. A lot of people hate it. But what's interesting is its interaction with the rest of the deck. Because if we discard a Dodoria for its effect to slam our opponent's turn and stop them from making extra attacks, Dodoria will play because it was discarded by a skill, since Dodoria doesn't care how he was discarded, only that he was, which means that normally DPU is a -2, since you lose the Dormant Potential and you lose a card from your hand. But in our case, the card we lose from our hand plays, which puts us to a -1, and then we can draw a card off a pod on our opponent's turn as well, making it a 0. So in a lot of decks where DPU is a -2, for us it's effectively a 0, which is a huge deal, especially in a deck that has a hard time actually drawing cards. Next, a green staple in general, but quickly, it's been on the rise, and it's an all-star in this deck, is our 4 copies of Tapion, Fate of a Hero. Fate of a Hero, in addition to having some Harudagon interactions, you can pay a single green energy and discard him to draw a card, and then at the end of the turn, you can play him, and he'll come out as a 15k blocker. What's nice about this is that he's a on-demand way to trigger Frieza's Army Healing Pod earlier in the game if you don't see all of your pieces. He's a great turn 1 play to help establish your defenses if you don't find a pod or a Demigra. He's pretty much useful all game since all the interactions that he has with the rest of the deck, on top of just being a very efficient card. Technically, you can use him, pay with him with a blue, but this is a mono green deck, so we're only ever paying the single green energy. And we don't use any of the Harudagon stuff, we just run him as the 15k blocker that draws us a card. Next, a archetype unique negate. We run 4 copies of Ginyu, Captain of the Elite. Some Frieza lists run a little bit less than 4, but this is actually one of the best cards in the entire archetype, and the reason for that is because of his auto when he gets played. So he costs 3 energy, but he becomes a 1 cost if you control a unison, and it's your opponent's turn. So he's really just like a 1 energy negate. He plays a 10k body, and when he comes down, you get to add a Frieza's Army card from your drop area to your hand. And if you do, you then discard a card. The best choice for this is, once again, Dodoria. You can add a Dodoria from your drop area to your hand, and then pitch the Dodoria that you just added, which will then play the Dodoria from your drop area and trigger your healing pot again. So DPU and Ginyu are 2 different 4-ofs that we run that allow us to trigger Frieza's Army Healing Pod and create card advantage on our opponent's turn as well. Maximizing your ability to create this advantage and stunt your opponent's turn will really impact your ability to succeed with this deck, because again, the draw power is really lacking on the front side, and in particular if you don't find a pod. So you should, again, mulligan very aggressively for pod. That's it for most of our 4-ofs. The rest of these cards are more tech support pieces. So first we run 3 copies of Zarbon, Frieza's right-hand man. Zarbon is a top 5 searcher for any other Frieza's Army card, so in a pinch he can be used to try to find a Doria or a Ginyu negate, since the Ginyu is a searchable negate. We don't use Zarbon the Gorgeous, which is the Frieza's Army super combo, but if we did, it would be a searchable target off of Zarbon as well. In addition, Zarbon has a activate battle, where if he's in the drop area, you can warp him to give either a leader or a unison a plus 10k. As I said, the draw power on this deck can be a little tight, so sometimes later in the game it's very useful to be able to just combo a 1 plus 10k from your drop area just to get out of a swing. So sometimes you'll have the energy left over, but not the cards to do anything with it. Next, we run 3 copies of Zarbon Cosmic Elite. Cosmic Elite is a really multi-purpose card that does a lot of different functions for us. So first, in this deck, we have a lot of basically dead cards. We desperately need to see 1 Healing Pod, 1 Demigra Unison, and 1 Dark Broly every single game. But every copy after that doesn't do anything. It's just literally a dead card. Zarbon is a way for us to turn those dead cards into actual utility. I mean, in addition to just charging them. Since he plays from our drop area for a single green energy with the additional cost of discarding a card. This, again, can be a way to trigger pod in the early to mid game if we don't find a Demigra or are having trouble establishing a unison for some reason, if we haven't found them. He's a 5k blocker, and he has an auto that says when he basically leaves the field for any reason, if our opponent has 5 or more cards in hand, they have to discard a card. So if our opponent has, say, 6 cards in hand or more, we can swing with leader, eat, a Zarbon for the leader auto, which will make them discard a card, and then Zarbon will make them discard a second card. Really, really powerful effect. And it's a way for us to simply just convert some of our, like, basically dead cards that we kind of end up with in our hand into actually useful things for relatively cheap energy investment. Next, we actually run 2 copies of Kakunsa, Beastly Maiden. Kakunsa is a 2 energy negate. Technically she costs 4, but she costs 2 less on her opponent's turn. So she's a 2 cost negate that with a 20k body, and when she comes down, she KOs one of our opponent's battle cards with no restrictions. We have a lot of decent spot removal thanks to things like Dormant Potential Unleash and Dark Broly, but we don't have a lot of like firm target removal. Kakunsa is a stat efficient body that gives us that little bit of extra removal we need, on top of being like 1 extra negate for us, and then a board relevant threat afterwards. She's only useful later in the game, unfortunately, because our early turns are really tight on energy. But on turn 4, turn 5, she can be like an extra late game negate that's really useful for us to help keep us alive in the game. Next, we run 2 copies of Fusamasu Deity's Wrath. This card is extraordinarily expensive, and you can swap it out for a lot of cheaper alternatives if you wish. But it's a very, very good card in this deck because Frieza, Green Frieza in particular, is a hand destruction deck first and foremost. And this allows us to turn a spare charismatic villain that has basically done its job into a static 20k body that rips a card out of our opponent's hand every turn. Games with this deck, if you're assuming you're able to win, will frequently go to turn 5 or turn 6. So even playing this guy on turn 4, you can easily get a few cards out of your opponent's hand. And in addition, 20k is about as big as we get in this deck, so the power on this body is also relevant. Into more utility stuff, we run 2 copies of Shocking Deathball. There's a grand total of 12 negates in this deck because this is a very defensive kind of turtly deck that you tend to stabilize sometimes at 2, 3 life, sometimes even 1. And the ability to have an extra negate we can pay for just by taking a life and pay for no energy can sometimes help with that by, you know, stopping like 1 extra surprise, like overwhelm swing that's really large, like a man on a mission or something. It's just like a common good green staple. Speaking of green staples, we also run 2 copies of Cell's Earth Destroying Kamehameha. We are a mono green deck, so we will always get the auto of getting to rip a card out of our opponent's hand at random. Really powerful in conjunction with our other hand rips and our leader's ability to also rip a card out of our hand at our choice. This deck in particular, you can frequently kind of just luck out and rip, you know, SCRs, important negates, super combos, things like that. Just because you shrink your opponent's hand down, and then you're pulling 2 to 3 cards out of their hand every turn, more or less at random, thanks to your leader. You're basically guaranteed to eventually tag something that's really useful. On top of that, it's just 15,000 combo power for an energy, which is nice. Finally, let's talk super combos. We run a full playset of Android 18 Bionic Blitz. Blitz is usable throughout the entire game. As I said, this is a very defensive kind of turtly deck, and it's important for us to have our defenses ready to go out the gate. So for us, this is our core super combo, since it's usable at any life total. I might play around with swapping one of the Bionic Blitzes out for Zarbon the Gorgeous, just so we can have a searchable draw super combo. If we had access to the Vanquisher of Villainy, the Sun Gohan Great Saiyaman super combo, you'd probably run like a 2-2 split, but it's off limits to us because we can't include Saiyans in our deck. So this makes this, like, for the most part, by far the best super combo. Some lists will run 2 copies of Dr. Gero to try to find a Demigra and put a Demigra into the drop area. You could do that if you wanted to, but you still have to pay the energy to get the, or, I'm sorry, not the Demigra, I'm sorry, the Dabura. correction, to pull a Dabura out of your deck. You can use that if you wanted to, but it's still like a relatively like lackluster super combo, and it only puts it in the drop area. We have a decent amount of draw and search, so I usually just opt to try to find Dabura more or less naturally. If you wanted to go that route, you could. Core message here is that the super combo is kind of modular to what you want, but for us, in this profile in particular, we go with a full set of Bionic Blitz. And then finally, the SCR for the deck is Kai. This is one of the other big improvements for Greenza, because a lot of SCRs are Saiyans that are green, at least. The only SCRs that this deck used to be able to run were Black Smoke Dragon, in theory, Negative Energy Dragon Balls, and at least for ones that were useful, that was basically about it. All of the good green SCRs were Saiyans. Kai, in addition to being an extraordinarily powerful SCR, is also not a Saiyan. So this gives us a way to clear our opponent's board and stabilize a difficult game, while also possibly stopping a couple of attacks on our opponent's turn. If you don't have Kai, the Negative Energy Dragon Balls can be a surprisingly good SCR in this deck, because it's very easy to get up to 7 or 8 battle cards in your drop area, which makes it effectively free. So it can be an activate battle to wipe the board clear at the end of your opponent's turn. It wipes our board too, but most of the cards we put into play die immediately afterwards, so it doesn't affect us very much. So if you either don't have a Kai or don't want to shell out for a Kai, you can use the Negative Energy Dragon Balls, and you'll find they're actually really good. Not quite as good as Kai, of course, but surprisingly good in this deck. And that concludes our deck profile for Starter Frieza. It's a clean 50 cards, and we keep the deck size as low as possible to make the deck as consistent as possible. Because again, we kind of desperately need to see all of our pieces as much as we can. Now, as per standard, we're going to talk about some things you can do if you happen to see, in theory, not that it's very likely because not all people play this deck, but if you do see Starter Frieza across the table from you, some things you can do to play against it. First, and this is the biggest thing to keep in mind about Frieza, is that Frieza's late game hand destruction and board control is really terrifying, but its first 2 turns are fragile, to say the least. You usually spend turns just setting up unisons, playing pods, playing searchers. You're trying to get your other pieces together. Sometimes they don't find a Dark Broly on turn 3, and they're kind of stuck spinning around with the Jamiga unison, which is still a 15k critical. It's still something, but it's not ideal. Turning up the pressure and trying to plow through the leader as much as you can is one of the biggest things you can do. And as a rule of thumb, if they opt to swing at you to try to take a card out of your hand by killing a Frieza's army, don't combo out of the swing. Don't negate it. Just take the damage. Because the quicker you can get to awaken and doing your thing, the better. And you really don't want to waste cards early on small swings against this deck, because you're going to need every card you can to stave off losing your entire hand. The other thing you can do, and this is mostly a black specific thing, but blue is getting some tools in this arena as well, is find ways to more permanently get rid of Dodoria. If you play something that warps Dodoria or puts Dodoria to the bottom of the deck, you can leave Frieza stranded unless they have a way to find a second copy. And as an extension of that, if you just a way to punish Dodoria from playing, like Black Mass Saiyan, can also go a long way. This deck has some tools to remove Black Mass Saiyan, thanks to Shocking Death Ball and DPU and things like that. But if they don't find that, or you stick it later in the game and they don't have those tools anymore, Black Mass Saiyan can shut this deck down cold, because basically everything we do revolves around cheating this little tiny Dodoria out. Incidentally, Black Mass Saiyan can pretty much hand control the hand control deck. But yeah, so those are some tips that you can try to use if you happen to see this deck across the way from you. It's a really, really fun green deck that has a lot of potential and does some really powerful stuff. So if you're looking for a different version of green to some of the other things that have been running around, you should really give this list or a list like this a try. Some of the recent support from things like Fate of a Hero and Kai really have greatly improved the overall power of this deck. But that wraps us up for today's profile. Thanks, guys, for checking us out, and we'll see you next time. And once again, thanks for entering the chamber.